Hi, everyone. My name is Bridgett Colling, and I'm joined here today by Jennifer MacArthur, who's the founder of Borderline Media. She's an impact producer, and she does incredible work in the documentary film world. And we're really excited to have her with us here today to work with us on the second webinar in C3's series on diversity and inclusion. And today we're going to focus on dismantling racism within nonprofit organizations. And so I'll let Jennifer say a little bit more about herself. And we'll dive right into this here.
Oh, sorry about that. There we go. I know how PowerPoint works. My apologies. um, so it's great to be with you all today. I just want to speak a little bit about my work, so you get a sense of why I'm talking about this at all. I have been, and thank you to Bridgett and the C3 team for inviting me to join you for this conversation. I have been working in media and documentary specifically for the last 10 years and designing campaigns around film and radio and media and interactive projects that oftentimes look at the intersections of how race and class and gender play out in the way that we think about our communities, our public institutions, and how we come together as a community to think about education, healthcare, criminal justice, all these different things. And so as a strategist and somebody who's tried to figure out how do we use stories and narratives to open up dialogues that we can have smarter, better, and more effective conversations about really sticky issues like race and class and gender. I've had to spend a lot of time researching social science research and public opinion research and spending a lot of time in community around the country talking to groups of people and understanding their perspectives and where they're coming from and figuring out how to shape dialogue and conversation around film and media that's going to be fruitful and move us forward. So some of what I'm going to be presenting will be a little bit about what I've learned as I've been doing my work, and a lot of it is going to come from some great social science research and books that we will share at the end for you to see. So before we get started, we want to ask folks what brought you here today. What kind of issues are you dealing with internally at your organizations, or what kind of diversity initiatives are you working on? And if you want to put that into the chat so that we can get a sense of what you're doing, we might be able to shape the dialogue and the Q&A at the end based on what your needs are. Is there anything else you want to add to that, Bridgett?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so throughout the presentation, feel free to please put your answers here in the questions field. That seems to work best in GoToWebinar. So, add any responses. We'd love to hear, what motivated you to come to this webinar here in the questions field today. I'll be looking through those, and I can share out some of those responses. And then throughout the webinar, if you do have any questions, comments, anything like that, Jennifer, I'll raise anything that seems particularly pertinent as it comes in. And if it's anything like the last webinar that we did, we'll have a lot of really wonderful questions and comments from everyone. And we'll get to as many as possible. If we're not able to get to them all, we can follow up with you after, or hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions as well. So I'm seeing some comments coming in here. Someone says, inclusion is a really important value to us, and we're looking for practical ways to implement. That's great. Someone else says, our organization has a predominantly white staff and board for its 40-year existence, but it doesn't reflect the full diversity of our constituency. We want to work on that. Amen.
Yes. Yes. So I think, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just one more before we dive in. So someone says, we're starting a diversity committee at our foundation, and it's been challenging to get leadership buy-in. So that's great. I think we've got some good practical advice in here, and I know Jennifer especially has some focus on leadership in here as well. So those are all great to see, and we'll definitely keep that in mind as we're going through the webinar today.
Fantastic. Thank you. I didn't mean to cut you off. So let's look at the agenda, because I'm gonna try to back up a little bit and give some context before we get more specific into well, to start, I want to give a little bit of culture, the cultural moment we're in, and some context around race and racism, what this means for nonprofits, how it impacts us, and what it means for us moving forward, and then dig a little bit more into tools that we can deal with to kind of work on dismantling racism. I don't think we've been trying to dismantle racism for a few hundred years, so I think we should be gentle to ourselves. That'll be my number one thing, that this is a process and relationships that we're talking about. So, know that. Let's start with there. But I think Bridget's going to have some great stuff at the end there to talk about what C3's been doing specifically as well. And just to back up, the number one, why I kind of want to give this cultural moment and talk about this a little bit more is that I think up until recently, I've seen the conversation around diversity and the focus on diversity and not so much inclusion kind of play out in a way that it feels as if we're doing people of color a favor, right? Why something for them, how we're going to help them assimilate into majority or majority institutions, or what the majority is doing, as opposed to looking at why this is beneficial for everyone. So I want to kind of dig a little bit into what's happening right now and what that means for us, and why we need to move away from this conversation about diversity and really into one talking about inclusion, right? So why is this important? So this is an article I came across a few years ago that I thought was great, The Gray and the Brown of the Generational Mismatch, and it gave some data about what's happening, just basic demographics, basic numbers, right? This first data point actually comes from a book called Brown is the New White, which is also fantastic. But this tells you some things that are important to realize. Our population is increasing by 8,000 people, and nearly 90% of that growth is people of color. People of color make up 2/5 of all children under 18. People of color will make a majority of American children as early as 2023. That's in 13 years. Is that right? Or yes? No, I can't count. That's the problem. I'm still thinking that it's 2010, right? Sorry, 7 years. 4/5 of American seniors are white, and whites will still comprise about 2/3 of the senior population by 2040. So there's, demographers have talked about this as the gray and the brown. As you've got this older population, which is whiter, and this younger population of millennials and younger that are much more multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural. And Stephen Kleinberg talks about what this means. The future of America is in this question. Will the baby boomers recognize they have a responsibility and take a personal stake in ensuring that this new generation of largely Latino and African American kids are prepared to succeed? This ethnic transformation could be the greatest asset this country will have, with a young, multilingual, well-educated workforce, or it could tear us apart and become a major liability. This is a sociologist based out of Rice University who's been doing the Kinder survey since the late 1990s. I think it's 99, and is now, is the founding director of what's become the institute there, the Kinder Institute. And I think this is a really critical thing here, and that we're looking at this generation gap, this cultural generation gap, where you've got this aging, wealthier white population that's increasingly resistant to taxes and public spending, right? That's the conversation that we're seeing playing out in our public discourse. And you have a younger multiracial population that views public education, health, social welfare programs, all these government programs and public programs as the best ladder of opportunity for themselves and their children. And you have these two groups of people, large, demographic groups that kind of balance themselves out in numbers. So much for us Gen Xers, us poor babies in between, without the numbers to do anything. But you've got this fight going on between these two big generations, and it's equaling political gridlock, right? And the ironic part about it is, the ironic part about it is that, if you look at it from a from not an altruistic perspective, but just pure self-interest, this older, whiter population is going to need the younger population of Black and brown and Asian people in America to be highly educated, to be have great professional jobs, so that the taxes that they pay into the United States, into payroll taxes, will fund Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare for the foreseeable future for our retirees who happen to be much whiter, and in the other way. At this current moment in time, much of the wealth exists among the older white population who doesn't want to put money, is resistant to putting money into taxes and public spending and public education and the kinds of programs and resources that could help our younger generation become better educated and get better jobs and all these things. So there needs to be this people need to look outside of themselves in their immediate moment in time and their immediate needs to see what's best for the future of everyone. But at this moment, it doesn't seem like that's necessarily happening. We've got this political gridlock going on, and I call it battles in the cultural generation gap wars. And you see this playing out all over the country. The SB 1070 immigration law in Arizona, also known as the Papers, Please law. You've got Donald Trump's presidential campaign, which has gone beyond, what's been the last 30, 40 years of dog whistle, what many people call dog whistle politics, into being just blatant, open, keep the Muslims out, build the wall against those brown Mexicans who are rapists and criminals coming in, kind of conversation. 60 plus attempts by House Republicans to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and that's on the political end. You also have this stuff happening culturally. So you've got Beyonce's Super Bowl performance, where she didn't have very much political content, explicit political content. Was kind of it was basically all symbolic, but looked at as by a lot of people as anti-cop, as anti-white. There's Oscar So White, and this month right now going on, there is a Twitter chat kicked off by Margaret Cho, whitewashed out, in response to Asian Americans being invited to, not hired to play roles that are supposed to be Asian American, that white people are being asked to portray Asian Americans in all these films, which is unbelievable that this is still going on so many years into Hollywood's existence, but what can we say? And then Define American, from Antonio Vargas and Jose Antonio Vargas, coming out, quote unquote, as undocumented, and the United We Dream, youth movement, the Dreamers movement. So these are all, ways in which the stuff is playing out in our culture right now, and we can see that. So how does this impact the nonprofit and NGO sector? Why do we need to care about this? Why do we need to think about this? And besides the fact that this is our country, this is our community, this is our culture, this is what we're a part of, and For many of us, I think because we get foundation funding or we're funded by public sector dollars, there's traditionally been this touchy, and it is hard, this line that we have to sort of be careful not to cross around advocacy. And many of this could seem like it's advocacy and it's organizing for advocacy. But in fact, I think we need to get beyond some of the way we think about this stuff as being advocacy, and look at these hard numbers and help that define our culture of service, right? So as these older and younger voters clash over taxes and public spending, NGOs are oftentimes expected to pick up the slack in providing what was once publicly funded services to the community. A lot of stuff is being privatized, obviously, push to privatize public education and other things like that, but there are lots of ways in which nonprofit NGOs are stepping into the breach where publicly funded services are being contested, right, or have been contested for the last 30, 40 years. So the things that you have to think about as you're defining your culture of service in this moment in time, which populations do you serve? And this is an issue, and having worked in public broadcasting and sort of seeing the tensions within public broadcasting, I think this is a perfect example where public broadcasting comes out of this the 20th century, out of a one-to-many broadcast model that at a moment in time when America was a majority white country and wasn't shrinking, right? In that it was solidly a majority white country, and serving that population. Now we're at this moment in time when these things are shifting, and for the future, they're challenged by figuring out how to provide content and services that appeal to this younger multicultural population, which actually doesn't necessarily have, there are certainly people who will give and want to contribute member dollars, but public broadcasting is tied to, we know this is a 66-plus-year-old demographic of baby boomers. So how do you figure out how to serve that population, and maybe also the multiracial millennial generation? Do you try to serve both? How do you figure out how to solve the tensions between what the needs are between both communities? What are the programs? Who do you hire to execute on this? These are the things that you have to think about, and making those decisions, no matter what, you've got to develop some level of cultural competency across all the, both of these generational cohorts, to be able to hire people and retain them, and then to actually provide services that people want. So it's not just what's going on internally at your organization, but it's also thinking about how you're going to serve people outside of your organization. So this comes from this really great Deloitte doing incredible work, I think. This is in the corporate sector, which I encourage folks, and I know there's oftentimes a bristle when we think about looking to the corporate sector for taking things from what they're doing and pulling them into our processes in the nonprofit world. They are very different. And I think oftentimes when we talk about that, a secret way to try to privatize, right? We don't necessarily want that. But I do think that there are ways in which there is the corporate sector has been very forward-thinking in moving away from our kind of diversity model and into an inclusion model which thinks about things intersectionally, right? So this piece, this report that was written, What if the Road to Inclusion Were Really an Intersection, specifically points out that it's in part millennials, this younger generation, that are more, they're more focused on the multiplicity of their identities, their whole self, as opposed to the sort of conventional racial delineations, or race, gender, sexual orientation, that we have to think broader. And this is something that a slide that was used in the last presentation that I think speaks to this, right? So in the center here, these physical abilities and characteristics are oftentimes the ways that we think about diversity, and we hone in on these delineations that are very specific around characteristics, and that we really need to broaden beyond the specificity of that and into a broader way of thinking about what other things that constitute diversity: people's work experience, their communication styles, their political beliefs, their geographic locations. I know that personally I grew up in New England. I was born in London. I lived in Alaska in the Pacific Northwest for 8 years, and then I came back to New York City. And each one of those, each one of those experiences, the years, were very, very different. For not just the stuff that's in the center here, but all the stuff around. Alaska, having lived in Alaska for 8 years, and being surrounded by so many people who lived on military bases and worked in the military, and how that had an impact on the way that I thought about people in the military, and changed my perception of soldiers and veterans. Has just been invaluable for me in being able to connect with the veterans community. That's just one of the many things in here that I could speak to, just for me personally. So I encourage you to think about, what are the ways in which your different life experiences with this stuff on the outside circle are as important, or maybe more important oftentimes, to connect with other people, rather than this stuff in the center around age or race or class, gender, etc. So the role of leadership, right? So now I want to move into the space of really talking about, and Bridgett will delve into this some more shortly too, of the role of leadership. And it's something I definitely saw in public broadcasting, and on the station level specifically, is that there can be a push from the grassroots, or from people that work on staff, or even from the community to some degree, in terms of culture change inside an organization. But it really takes the leadership. It really takes a commitment by your executives to actually shift and move an organization. They're steering the boat, right? And so according to the psychologist and science journalist Daniel Coleman, he sort of really digs into this concept of emotional intelligence, and says, in order to create a more inclusive work culture, it's important for leaders to develop more emotional intelligence. And the 5 different aspects of emotional intelligence are self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skill. So for the purposes of this, because I also am not sure how much time we have. Do you have a time check?
Yeah, we're doing great.
Okay.
We've got another 40 minutes.
Okay, fantastic. Because I want to leave time for questions, and I know I want you to be able to go through your stuff too. So we're just going to dig, for the purposes of this, we're not going to go through all the different 5 points of emotional intelligence, but we're just going to speak to a little bit around self-awareness, okay? And so, and I didn't add on here, I realize this is a little, this might be a little button pushing. So self-awareness, common patterns of well-intentioned white people. This comes from the book, What Does It Mean to Be White by Robin DiAngelo. Robin DiAngelo is a white woman who grew up working class, and poor working class, and through education was able to kind of elevate her class status. And she talks a little bit about this in her book. She digs into intersectionality a little bit, and sort of how sometimes white people can be dismissive or discount or try to dismiss the role of race and how that white privilege is something that happens or that exists for white people around race, regardless of what their class status is, and how your class status can sometimes complicate that and complicate understanding that and what that means. But just to talk a little bit about her, because I think she's this really interesting woman. She got a degree in sociology, an undergrad degree, went to college, and one of her first jobs out of college after getting this degree was to work with a group teaching diversity trainings in the city of Seattle. Apparently, the city had run afoul of E&O requirements and ended up having to have a whole big diversity training program brought in for employees. And so she did this diversity training program with a black woman, a colleague of hers. There are several people that were doing it, but she was partnered with this one black woman. And in that process of doing the diversity trainings, she discerned that there were certain patterns of white people, of whiteness, right? And she took from that and got her PhD and wrote the book, What Does It Mean to Be White? And one of the other things that you may have heard if you've done some reading on the internet, if you haven't read this book, but you may be familiar with a phrase or a term that she coined recently, white fragility, which has sort of been making the rounds on the internet for the last couple of years, and a couple of articles have been written about it, and she talks about it in the book. But one section, she does a whole chapter on common patterns of well-intentioned white people. And I thought that, and there are more than these, but I thought that these would actually be helpful in the context of this conversation around stuff that happens, that can happen, or that often happens in workplace settings, and why, particularly as leaders in nonprofits, why it's problematic, right? If you are hiring and trying to retain people of color on your staff, or if you have other kinds of if it's not just a largely white staff, if you're also trying to bring in more women or LGBTQ from the LGBT community, or any people who are disabled, that these are all issues that play out. But specifically, I kind of want to focus on the race question here, because we are talking about dismantling racism. So I don't know, Bridgett, if you feel like here you want to jump in with me, but I wanted to sort of talk through some of, because I'm a little touchy about talking about the patterns of white people and what white people do, given that I'm not white.
Right. I'm glad I'm here to support.
And so I firmly believe in that, that we should all be speaking about our own experiences and speaking to that. But some of the things that she pointed out, rushing to prove oneself, I think this is sort of a big one, of people who try to prove that they're not racist, that they may approach colleagues of color and talk about, explicitly bring up instances where other, white people did. This ties to the third one, acknowledging racism in other whites, not oneself, but explicitly trying to talk about ways in which they've experienced the racism of other white people, and they've had to tell them how it was racist, or deal with the racism of other whites. This is often done definitely around Thanksgiving dinner conversation. Oh, my racist uncle, or my racist blah, 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 and I had to do blah, 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 blah. And the way in which that becomes off-putting for some people of color, because essentially they're objectified in that conversation. The one thing that you end up queuing in on is the race, and you don't see the multiplicity of their other parts of who they are.
Yeah. I think as a white lady, I'm totally guilty of this one personally. Even in the context of this work that I've been doing at C3 and trying to do more learning and coaching around how nonprofits can develop diversity and inclusion strategies. Actually, one event that I can think of in particular, a I was at a networking event called Lesbians Who Tech. Lots of lesbians, queer people there. Met a woman there who was a black lesbian woman, and she was really interested in talking about diversity and inclusion with me. And I was like, "That's so cool. I'm super interested in talking about that with you." And so we got coffee and talked about it. And I came in feeling really gung ho and excited about talking about the race and racism component. And I think she, as a black woman, felt like I mean, and I didn't unpack this with her, but I got the feeling in our conversation like she was really hoping to, I mean, especially coming from speaking at an event called Lesbians Who Tech, was really excited to talk about getting more LGBTQ people into the workforce, particularly in tech. And here's me, social justice warrior, talking about dismantling racism. I don't think she was horribly offended, but I think at the same time she was kind of like, okay, please, let's recognize the fact that I'm a multifaceted person, and just because I'm a black woman, I'm not going to help you develop your diversity and inclusion strategy. I'm here to talk about LGBTQ stuff. Not that she didn't care about it, but I think for me, in wanting to uphold number three here and not blame other white people, I think that's one thing that I can think of in my own experience, where even being so well intentioned, I could totally tell that I made this woman feel like I was trying to prove myself as like a cool white girl who was like for race and racism. It's really annoying, I'm sure. And so I think it's good to be honest with ourselves about those moments too, because I think I'm really trying to do something good, but at the same time, we all fail in certain moments, and that happens, and we learn from them.
Yes, yes. And that's funny, especially since when you said I was at a thing called Lesbians Who Tech and I brought up her race.
Yeah,
Yeah. Um, but see, that kind of just goes to show you how deeply embedded the racial piece is for so many of us, that we can't get past that part and start looking at people and in the broader context of the fullness of who they are.
mm-hmm.
And we all do this, right? This is not just me beating up on you right now, Bridgett.
Okay, you can tell you what.
Assuming people of color have the same experience you do, I think that this is, and this is particular. I think this is can be difficult, and I've had this experience, but I think Robin DiAngelo brings up in the example in her book. She talks about attending the white privilege conference, and I recently and how she went up to a group of her friends and colleagues who were people of color at some point during the conference, and was all excited to talk about, isn't it so great that white people are deconstructing race, and they're talking about their privilege, and they're talking about this, that, and the other, and this is such a great conference. And although and this is sort of the conflict oftentimes, I think, for many people of color, that these are different. We're also having a difficult time. These are hard conversations to have, and sometimes they're triggering, and sometimes they don't feel great, even though it's great that white people are entering the conversation and grappling around race and their own sense of who they are, and talking about it. And in real terms, it can still be off-putting or still be difficult for people of color to experience that. And she just didn't pick up the fact that they weren't gonna respond to the way that white people were engaging in the dialogue in the same way. That it's not necessarily an intellectual exercise for them, because the emotional impacts for them and the real world impacts for them are very different than when white people come to this conversation around race and how they experience race. Essentially thinking about it with a power analysis. When you're an empowered person and you come to the conversation versus somebody who's dealing with being disempowered, yes, you definitely want that acknowledgement and you want people to have the conversation, but it's still challenging. Um, and I recently, you know, I had an experience of this recently and saw colleagues attending the Tribeca Interactive program, the VR program this year. And it wasn't VR, but one of the projects was Whitney Dow's The Whiteness Project, and it's doing its second iteration. Um, and I could see white people engaging with the content and sort of having some aha moments, and some people of color sort of, you know, appreciating it, but many feeling very put off by it. And so, you know, understanding that those experiences are different is really important.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm seeing a great comment here that says, yes, I hate when it's an academic experience for others and such an emotional, real, personal experience for other people.
yes, there you go. Exactly. So yes, there's that, but then understand the power dynamic too, right? So if you are a leader, if you're an executive you know, if you're the director of your, or the executive director of your nonprofit, and you've got, you know, staff of color that are working with you, under you, and you come to this conversation all excited, and it's something that's very, you know, it could be, not necessarily, but it could be something that's more academic, or you're distant from it, and people of color are not feeling that. Um, Perhaps the tactic is, you know, spending more time listening before talking, right? So that, because knowing that you come to this conversation with the power, you know, the distance, the ways in which you have power as a leader, is really very important. Um, and that ties to something here, focusing on delivery, and that's often, you know, in common parlance described as tone policing, and expecting a certain level of respectability politics, right? So if a person of color talks about an experience they had, or they're angry, or they're upset with something, or they're frustrated and they're passionate about it, and you know, um, white folks end up sort of tone policing them. I needed to hear it this way in order for me to feel comfortable talking to you about it, or, you know, can you just, you know, speak about it in this circumstance, or let's keep that conversation or that dialogue only for this meeting. That, you know, those kinds of ways in which there's a focus on how people of color are talking about the behavior, rather than the racist behavior, right?
I think I see a lot of this too around the Black Lives Matter movement, especially, and how people say, "Oh, you know, they're interrupting people, and it's really rude, and you know, they're doing this protest action." I can think of, you know, thinking
Yes.
back a year ago, year and a half ago, with the Bernie Sanders speaking at Netroots and Black Lives Matter. Netroots is a big progressive conference with a bunch of progressive people there, a lot of progressive white people, progressive people of color as well. But there was a protest action there during Bernie Sanders' keynote, and the vitriol that I saw in the room, being there, in the conference app, in the comments on Facebook, on talking about the protest action, was just so. I mean, it surprised me, and it shouldn't have, just because it was a room full of, like, this is like the most progressive people in the nation, and we're still really grappling with, you know, telling essentially black women to be quiet while a white guy is speaking, because they thought it was rude. And when this guy literally a platform on which to share his message all over the nation, I think, you know, thinking about, I don't know, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to grapple with when we think about how important we make our own comfort, and how it's important to be uncomfortable, and let ourselves just kind of sit with those situations, and like Jennifer was saying, you know, take time to listen before we react to something.
Um, yes, absolutely. And then the last piece, if they won't teach me, I can't know. And that's you know, something where, and I've definitely experienced this, of people not being responsible for their own understanding. People, not this conversation around race and racism. Um, Obviously has been going on for a very long time. It's not new. There are also now some incredible, wonderful tools that are available online. There are white-led organizations that, about race and racism, and that people of color can't be always on the hook to teach you um, uh, how to think about these things, how to approach conversation and dialogue. Though at the same time, this is essentially the work. How I see the work that I do is being in conversation with white people across these dialogues, so that we can have meaningful conversation, and there's some level of accountability. I think it's not fair to hold it's not fair to hold people of color to that standard. That white people have to do their own work, essentially.
Yeah. I think we're getting some interesting questions in here too. So one person asked, so a lot of my colleagues say it's not about race, it's about wealth or income, which I know, Jennifer, we talked about this a little bit. And she gets this from white colleagues a lot. And especially for white people who grew up poor, they have trouble seeing that there's an inherent privilege being white. So how do you reconcile with that, especially when communicating with colleagues who might be coming into understanding their own privilege for the first time, or maybe they're not even there yet?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think this is a really tough one, and I think there are a number of great thought pieces and articles and things that you can share with people rather than get into a dialogue or a conversation with folks about it, because I do think that it can be triggering, it can be very difficult, and you can stall and not actually help people move at all. And there is, I wish I had it right in front of my fingertips, but there's one piece online that I found that was really great about riding a bicycle, and it's this woman who
Yeah,
talks about. Do you know what I'm talking about,
I
Bridgett?
do. Yeah, was it the one like how comparing riding a bike and being in a car to being a person of color
Yes.
and white? That
To
one.
white privilege, basically, describing how the entire system, if you're a bike rider and you're on the road, in America anyway, this is not in Copenhagen or any cool place where they actually they have bike lanes and all
Those are
just for
hard in
biking.
English.
That basically, the roads, we all use the roads. We all say, yeah, everyone can use the road. You can drive your car on it, you can use your bicycle on it, or you can walk on the sidewalks, right, of the roads. But you quickly find that on the whole, most roads are designed for cars, right? That most roads don't have bike lanes. A lot of roads outside of, walking cities like New York don't even have sidewalks. Yet people are it's still assumed that people can walk or ride their bikes on these roads. But in the process of doing that, it's really dangerous, right? You don't have a special lane that's made for you. You don't have something that's set aside for you. So you are expected to navigate the roads with cars that are bigger, that are more powerful, that have more, that can go faster than you, and on an infrastructure that's actually designed for them, to help them go bigger, to help them go faster, to help them, speed down the highway, what have you. So there, there's a great way in which she talks about how the structure of things are set up to make it easier for people, certain kinds of people, regardless of the fact that we all can use the roads. And that's probably not the totally the best one, but I think I can, if you want, Bridgett, if people want stuff sent to them, I can send a whole bunch of resources for folks to share, to open up some of these dialogues and conversations about white privilege and class.
Yeah,
Because I know that
and
that's a touchy one.
Yeah, I'll find that. I have that link bookmarked somewhere too because I thought that bike metaphor was so great. So I'll share that one after as well. And some people are adding some to the comments here as well. So thank you to those of you who are sharing your links now. If
Thank you,
there's
awesome
things that
people.
you read that you felt like would be helpful, feel free to drop them in the comments here, and I will share them out after.
And I would do that, except if I do that, then you're going to see all the rest of my computer desktop. So actually talking about whiteness in class, I want to share this slide that you maybe have you talk through this, Bridgett, because I think
Yes.
it talks a little bit about a white culture, but I do think that this culture, this sort of is actually really a white class culture. There is a certain kind of middle class status that's attached to some of these ways of being. So, do you want to dig into this a little bit?
Absolutely. And I want to touch on this briefly. I wish we had more time, but I do. I promise I have some like more tactical stuff in here that we're going to
Yeah.
wrap up with because I know everyone loves the tactical stuff. And so we're getting there. We had a lot to dig into, but I hope you're finding this conversation to be really meaningful and helpful. And so for me, I think something that I have grappled with a lot as a white lady is like being white is often thought of as like the absence of a race. And Jennifer mentioned Whitney Dial's The Whiteness Project earlier. And if you look at those videos and watch a lot of them, a lot of the young white people in those videos say that they hadn't really ever thought about their race and they don't really feel like they get many benefits from their race, and that's because they just don't have to think about it really. That's part of the privilege of whiteness. And so actually, I was talking to a friend of mine who works at a group called Michigan United, which is an organizing group in Michigan. And they do a lot of trainings around dismantling racism in nonprofits. And she said one of the things that she found most helpful and enlightening, and she's also a white lady, was to just think about what a culture of whiteness is in a workplace, like what that looks like. And when I read a lot of these things, I mean, some of them kind of hurt. And obviously, I mean, there's like a million positive attributes that come with being white. But I think some of these feel like they sting a little. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, this is definitely something that I've seen resonate, particularly in, like Jennifer was mentioning, white middle class culture. And I think it can be hard. I think I've heard from people who I've communicated with about diversity and inclusion that we say that we need to not be, testing someone to be a culture fit for our organization, but we want to make sure that they're still a good values fit. So, like, what's the white culture that we need to be aware of that we're trying to smush people into? And for me, all of this, I feel like plays into that a bit. So we'll send out these slides after, and I'm happy to talk about this more. But I also want to jump into some of the more practical stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And just Robin DiAngelo does talk about this a little bit in her book under the guise of white fragility. I think a lot of these things are the same. They would be called this culture of whiteness,
Mm-hmm.
definitely. Okay.
So I wanted
So
to,
do you want to take it
yeah,
from here? Like
yeah.
slides?
Will
Okay.
you? Do you mind still running the slides so I don't have to switch over to?
Yeah, sure, sure, sure.
I'll just tell you when to go to the next one. So I just want to share some examples. So C3, we've been having regular conversations around race and racism within our company. And someone asked in the comments earlier, so how is all this stuff actually being applied to nonprofits? Great question. And I think really what it starts with nonprofits is having a conversation, which I think sounds like so. I mean, I've been working in and around racial justice for a while, but I think the idea of like having a conversation being a big game changing next step feels kind of like, is that really it? But I think like seriously digging into these, like if you're ready to have the uncomfortable kinds of conversations around race and racism within an organization, it totally it changes minds. It changes the way that people think about hiring and recruiting and creating inclusive spaces for people of color within an organization, because a lot of people within even very progressive organizations aren't talking about this stuff with the same language or coming to it with the same kind of understanding. And I think laying that groundwork can be so transformative in an organization much more transformative than hiring people. Hiring people of color is so important, but I think if you're hiring people of color into an organization that has not been set up to be inclusive to them and set up with some kind of understanding of the impact that having systemic racism affect your organization for probably decades has had on the org. I feel like you're just set up for way more success and growth as an organization in this area. And so we at C3 had had all of our staff read a few different pieces on race and racism. One was Peggy McIntosh's Backpack of White Privilege, which I can send out after. Another one was the Western States resource book for dismantling racism within organizations, which is a huge, lengthy read, lots of juicy stuff in there. And then we had a conversation about it, and it was definitely awkward at points. And so we started with kind of some safe space ground rules to get everyone feeling like on the same page. And I think one of the important things here is that we just gave people permission to be uncomfortable at the beginning of the conversation. And that seemed to be, that just letting people know that like that's the point. That felt like really meaningful. You can go to the next slide, Jennifer. And then we also set goals for ourselves, so everyone had the same expectations of what we wanted to get out of it. So really, the goal for the conversation in that moment was just to give people an uncomfortable space, but also to know that we have this long-term vision for our team, for our company, to be more inclusive and to not just infuse this into. I think it even goes beyond infusing it into our work, but also in ongoing conversations with our colleagues, with our families. And what's been really rewarding about continuing to have this conversation is that people have been reporting back about how this has actually shifted the kinds of conversations that they're having with their families around the dinner table at holidays, and helping them really think through how they want to talk to their kids about race and racism. And that to me is like the most powerful, meaningful outcome of this work so far. And I'm looking forward to seeing what else happens. You can go one other thing that we did in these conversations is really tie it back to our values as a company. I think some of the best advice that I've gotten on doing diversity and inclusion work within a nonprofit is that it needs to not be this like side thing. Like your diversity strategy should not be separate from your business strategy. It's really a part of it. And I think Jennifer was communicating that really well earlier and talking about the gray and the brown. If we as leaders in the nonprofit sector aren't seeing the connection between creating more inclusive organizations and our organizations being able to continue to thrive in the future, then we're missing the point. We're not doing our strategic planning well. And so we really tried to tie in this whole conversation to our values as a company to make it clear that this is not a side project. This is actually totally in line with everything that we're about. And then I just had some sample questions that we asked here. So we asked people how they're understanding privilege differently. You can go to the next one. We also had a whiteboard, and we put what is justice on that board, and then left it up for like a week or two and had people write their responses on there. So we read through some of those responses on the board, and then in the meeting kind of tweaked the question a bit and asked people how that definition changed when they added the word racial in front of it and really thought about racial justice and not justice generally. You go to the next one. And then also asked people what else do they want out of this process. So it was really important to me and other people in leadership at C3 that everyone in the company felt like they had some ownership over what we were doing when it came to talking about diversity and inclusion. And so we've opened up to talking about different kinds of diversity beyond race and racism, or behind race. And we're also talking more about, how do we want to be leaders in the nonprofit world, which is how we got to this webinar today. And so I think it's important to have these efforts not be just focused on one individual, but really about everyone on a team contributing together and seeing this as something positive for everyone. And so just some things about moving beyond conversation. I think developing really concrete goals is important. I touched on this earlier. Talking about this work publicly, I can say for us, honestly, it's helping to hold us accountable. We're still a very white full-time, our full-time staff is still very white. And I think having these conversations is really holding our feet to the fire as we're hiring for new positions and saying, hey, this is something that we're talking about publicly. We're totally behind this, and we will continue to be. And that means that as we grow as a company, we need to really be living these values. Getting leadership on board is so important. I know it can be challenging, and I'm happy to talk to other people more about how to get your leadership on board. We're really lucky at C3 to have leadership who is like great about all of this. And I think it's so essential to really making these conversations effective and meaningful, and having a long-term impact on the organization. And then finally, I said this on the last webinar, but I feel like it's worth saying again and again every day for forever. But so nonprofits, as we all know, are so often under-resourced in so many ways, but especially when it comes to HR. And I think for the thing that I want to say over and over again every day is that there's time if it's in your values. And so I think in the same way, there's money if it's in your values. And so if this is clearly a value for your organization, put some money in it, put some time behind it. I know we're all nonprofits, but that is, you do, at least in the society we're in right now, you need some money and time to create change. And that to me has been like a really meaningful kind of North Star guiding me through this work. So hope it's
3 and 4, I think, are so connected, right? If you don't have the leadership on board, there's no way that you're going to be able to get the resources invested in hiring, recruiting, and retaining people of color. Yeah. And I think getting leadership on board is about making, and I know for nonprofits, we're not supposed to make a profit, obviously, but you still are a business that has to operate, right? It's just a nonprofit one. And that means you have to have a plan for being sustainable and for thriving into the future. And I think you have to tie your business plan and your business case and why you exist and your mission and your vision to these things, right? They have to be integrated. And if they're not, then as Bridgett said earlier, it's going to continue to be a side thing that you just do when you feel like you have a little bit of resources to throw at it, rather than a core value that's built into the way that you built into your mission and built into your vision. Is there? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
One thing I do want to say. How much more time do we have?
We have 1 minute.
Oh my God!
Sorry, we've talked so much, but please.
I can stay on and keep talking if people want to answer questions.
Yeah, I have, I think I could take another 5 minutes or so. If people do have some pressing questions. We actually have one come in that I have some experience with, and Jennifer, I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well. So someone asked, do you have any suggestions for how to have conversations like this when most employees are white, but there are a couple people of color in the room? How do you have the conversation without making people of color feel like they represent all people of color?
Yeah,
so I can say how we did this at C3, and I would love to hear your perspective, Jennifer, as a person of color, not speaking for all people of color, just for yourself.
Yes.
So at C3, we had, when we were having these conversations, there was one person of color who was a part-time staff member who was in our office every day. And I invited her to, I talked to her about it beforehand, before we had the conversations, because I really didn't want her to feel tokenized. And I had a one-on-one conversation with her because so much of the discussion that we were having was really around like white people and white privilege and how white people need to grapple with race and racism. And so I just asked her candidly if she felt like she wanted to be a part of the conversation. And thankfully she did, and it was great to have her there. But I think there was definitely, she said she really enjoyed being a part of the conversation, but I'm sure there's probably some awkward moments in that conversation for her. So I would opt for just asking people. I mean, if the conversation is totally geared towards like talking about white privilege, asking the people of color if they really feel like they want to or need to be there.
I think that, yeah, I think in either way, you should, if you're in a situation, and I would say this, and it doesn't even, it just, if you're in a situation where you've got one or two people of one race in a room full of everybody else of a different race, you should be sensitive to those people and ask them the questions and talk to them beforehand. So if it's one white guy in a room full of 10 black people, or one white guy in a room full of like three black people, five Asians, two Latinos, you know what I'm saying? I think it's worthwhile to have a one-on-one with that person in advance and listen and spend some time asking the person, she or he, are you going to, will you feel comfortable in the situation? What can we do? How can we structure this so that it would feel more comfortable for you? I also think back to the resources question, or the resources and the leadership thing, I think it's worthwhile to get a facilitator in for these conversations, especially for organizations that are at a certain stage of their growth. I mean, for any organization, frankly. It's helpful to have somebody who can facilitate, somebody who's an experienced facilitator in dealing with questions of race and diversity and inclusion. I think it's worthwhile to have somebody in the room to help make that conversation fruitful and to keep tokenism to a minimum.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's all the questions that we had in our little questions box so far. If you have additional questions, Jennifer, if you go to the next slide, I think I put our emails on there.
Yep.
Yes.
And actually, this is not correct, my email. Sorry. It's just my first name. It's just jennifer@borderlinemedia.net. So don't look at that at all. I'm sorry. I should have provided you.
I should have double checked it.
That was her secret way of saying, don't send that black woman any email questions about race. She's protecting me.
The ultimate power move. If it's okay with Jennifer, I'll include her real email in the follow-up email to this webinar. And if you do have other questions for me or Jennifer, I'd be happy to talk to you more about any work that you're doing in this direction. I think it's great that you're all here today. Thank you so much. Thanks for staying a few extra minutes with us. And thank you so much to you, Jennifer, for this conversation. It was really fantastic.
Well, I really appreciate being invited to participate, and I'm glad that you were able to speak to some kind of tactical, real stuff there toward the end. I know that's really helpful, and I think it's important to have both. Have some of the theory and have some of the context, but definitely have some, followed up with the specifics. One without the other, you may not get it all. So.
Absolutely.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, so here are some of the resources that Jennifer mentioned in the webinar, and so we'll send out these slides and the recording after this, so you'll get all this stuff and any of the other resources that we mentioned during the webinar that people shared in the comments. So thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.